Becky, do we have many people in the waiting room? So I'll just give it a minute. Okay, I think we can get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at the first of what I hope will be several Speaking for English events this year. So I'm co-hosting this event with Becky Fisher, the CEO of the English Association, Alex Thompson, Chair of University English and Head of English at the University of Edinburgh, Claire Lees, Director of the Institute for English Studies, London School of Advanced Studies, and Professor Julie Sanders, of whom more in a moment. So I'm going to, in a minute, I'm going to tell you about why we've organised this series, Speaking for English, and introduce our speakers. But I wanted to just say a little bit about the schedule today. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Hopefully that will, you should see that. So, so we've got a loose structure today. But because we've never held an event quite like this before, it's infinitely flexible. We really want to focus on our speakers, Julie, Simon and David. They've been asked to speak for about 5 to 8 minutes, but I've seen the slides that they've got. And I can imagine there might be quite a lot of questions, and they are our distinguished speakers and guests today. So if we don't get to breakout groups, or if we have less time for breakout groups, that's absolutely fine by me. And I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, both for questions, but also to get guidance from people, so that everybody feels that they hear what they need, they get to ask the question that they want to ask, and so on. So, okay, so, right. Now, you'll see in the chat that Becky has added the details about the Twitter account if you wanted to keep the conversation live externally. When we're being recorded, I should mention that as well. Now, as you will have seen from the schedule, we do want to finish by 3:30 today. We've actually got 2 hours scheduled for this, but we felt that 1.5 hours is enough for Zoom time for all of us. But after 3:30, Claire, Alex, Julie and myself will stay online in case colleagues want to continue to chat with us a bit more privately. But we do have a cut-off time of 4 p.m. So why are we launching this new series, Speaking for English? Well, I think we all know the challenges facing English studies right now. The English Association, University English and the Institute for English Studies have been working ever more closely together for a number of years, representing English studies with one voice, sharing experience and resources, do a lot of responding to inquiries, not inquiries, but government consultations, that kind of thing. But we decided last year to take that collaboration to a new level, working in conversation with senior colleagues in our fields, like Julie on this call, like Janet Beer, the Vice Chancellor of Liverpool University, the policy team at the British Academy, especially Harriet Barnes, Sandeep Mahal, who leads one of our UNESCO Cities of Literature, the chair of our REF panel, Greg Walker, and many others in senior leadership roles in and beyond English studies. And out of our conversations have come 2 actions which we're now working on. One is a toolkit we're developing for the discipline, aimed at multiple audiences, from students to heads of school and media. This is being built by members of the University English Executive and English Association Higher Education Committee, and it's being led by Bob Eagleston and Catherine Heavey. And I can say a bit more about that later if people are interested. And I should say, I'm sorry, I'm passing on the apologies of Bob, who is teaching this afternoon. He can't join us. So that's one thing that we're doing. The other is this series, Speaking for English, of which this is the first, the aim of which is to build capacity within the discipline for leadership and influence, both within our institutions and across the sector more widely. We already have an offer from the British Academy to co-design a second event on policy if colleagues want that. And we have an offer also with a bit of arm bending from the HRC as well. So today, though, today's event is focused on university architecture, strategic planning and QR. And it's now time for me to introduce our speakers and to thank them very much for giving up time for us this afternoon. It's very, very pressurized time, right in the middle of the semester. So the first speaker will be Julie Sanders. She is Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Newcastle University and a force for good and an incredible advocate for the humanities, both within my institution and outwith. She leads on the university's value-led work and our commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion and social and environmental justice. She's a trustee of the Globe Theatre and also of Northern Stage based on Newcastle University's campus. She's also been involved in research review processes in Sweden and Ireland, and she was a member of the Australian Research Council panels in 2018-2019. She currently serves on the Research England Advisory Group for the Institute of Advanced Studies. And in addition to all of this, she is, as you will know, a distinguished professor of English literature and drama. And her current research is focused on Shakespeare and social justice, among other things. And she's also a co-editor of a commissioning series on early modern literary geographies for Oxford University Press. Simon Donoghue is the Director of Strategic Planning and Change at Newcastle University. He is responsible for strategic planning, strategy implementation, and strategic insight for the university. He has over 25 years of higher education leadership, management, consultancy, research, and teaching experience, including in the following roles: lead consultant for SUMS Consulting, head of the strategy project group at the University of Leeds, chief executive for the White Rose University Consortium, and board member for the US National Consortium for Continuous Improvement. In his previous role as lead consultant for SUMS Consulting, a not-for-profit higher education consultancy, he supported over 25 different universities with large strategic projects, including strategy development, target operating model development, longer-term change and process change capability, and reviewing the configuration and effectiveness of professional services. David Armagoni is currently the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at Keele University, although only for another 2 weeks, he told me this morning. He's been head of department, head of school, and director of Keele University's Research Institute of Humanities. He's also co-chair of a city culture compact in Stoke called Stoke Creates. I think he was busy hosting that this morning. He's also, of course, as you again know, a distinguished professor of Victorian literature. He's writing a monograph on social and biological inheritance in intellectual families, contributing across 3 generations to scientific and literary culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. So thank you very much, colleagues, for agreeing to speak today. I'd like to suggest that the speakers speak in order and that we save our questions for the end. So Julie, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denny, and lovely to see everyone today, albeit on the screen as ever. You do sometimes feel at these events a bit like an inaugural. Your life kind of flashes before your eyes as sort of undergraduate friends, undergraduate tutors, editors, former colleagues. It's very nice to be with you. Okay, I'm not going to waste too much time and just sort of jump in. It's certainly close to my heart to try and be involved in this event and future events in terms of speaking for English. And I'm going to start on a positive note, because I think despite everything that people might feel they're facing right now, I hope I'm going to try and encourage the discipline area to be as confident as possible in the strategic leadership space. And I'm not going to show slides, but I'm hopefully going to warm up for the detail that follows with Simon and David. And I'm just going to touch on that architecture word in the workshop title today. And the points do overlap. And I'm actually meaning by that not the buildings, the bricks and mortar, as it were, but the social architecture. And it's a phrase that a lot of my colleagues in management and business schools use, but I thought it was helpful to think our way into some of this and to think through relationships, really. In my mind, successful organisations of the future are going to be those that can tap into this new literacy of collaboration and co-production and community that's around in our research and our education, but it ought to be also informing our everyday working practices. And by that, I suppose I mean how we calibrate between what's often called the hierarchy in a university, but which is really just structures of governance and responsibility. And then there's this wider community, and that's where the heart is, and that's what it's about, really. So I'm going to try in the next few minutes to be ferociously positive about how heads of schools of English or heads of department or subject groups or those in associated roles like school managers, I want to be positive about the fact that understanding university social architecture is helpful and necessary, but it's also a game changer for people working in English studies. Because it's going to enable us to do our roles creatively and well in the future and to the broadest benefit of the communities we serve. It's crucial because we need English studies to be better understood, valued, appreciated and sponsored in our organisational cultures. That much is clear. And so there could have been a version of this talk that would have been all about managing up. And I hear that phrase a lot, how to work with your Vice-Chancellor and your executive board or your senior management team or whatever they call themselves. But actually, I think starting there overplays a command and control model that actually isn't what we believe in or what actually a lot of senior management teams want to happen. This is about collective responsibility for our beloved universities. I was actually interviewing a prospective colleague last week who gave a wonderful answer when asked by somebody, how will you manage an influencing role and relationship with your Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor, of course with me sitting on the Zoom call? And their answer was, I'm going to spend time with the students. I'm going to be grounded in the work of the organisation because then I'll be a better critical friend, advisor and enabler. And it was a fab answer, I suppose, and I wanted to kind of riff on why. I hate the phrase middle management, though you'll hear it a lot, but the roles of heads are often described as sort of two-way facing to a senior team in some way and then out to the broader university. And you have to be all things. You have to do the strategic thinking and the operational working. You have to have expertise in your subject area. You have to have expertise in programs of education, and you have to understand the research landscape. You have to be good at relationship management and social architecture. So I'm just going to touch on what might it be to be a good social architect at this time. And it's a snapshot, I suppose, of HE at the moment. It's not about starting with the VC or the deputy VC for that matter, I would say. Learn your community, learn our community. You often hear phrases like English isn't seen or understood or goes under the radar in my institution. And that won't be true for everybody on the call today, but it might be true for some of you, I think. So if we feel that is the case, have we really asked ourselves how much time then do we spend talking to ourselves about that problem, and how might we look outwards to address that across, beyond the school, beyond the department, beyond whatever structure of subject area you work in? Build our networks of affinity and in turn build their knowledge and competency is what we need to do. So you're building the literacy of the organisation, if you like, about this amazing subject that we teach, research and practice. So I can only pull on a few threads of this big ecosystem that makes up a university in the UK these days. But hopefully it suggests that some possibilities of ways of working and will be applicable, and we can pick up more in your questions from your particular vantage points. So careers teams, for example. Now this is not an employability talk, but it does connect to other really useful workshops that I know the English Association have been working on. It's ever more vital that in your organisation, the careers team can speak for English studies. Different pathways to employability that the subject in all its diverse glory can enable. And they need to be bringing you, the open-minded, the great employers and alumni, to service that set of good conversations. So it's about valuing the subject and the programs and what they can be and do and what they can become. I was involved earlier in the week with Wonky on a diverse social capital discussion, great panel actually, but it too easily fell immediately into law and the professions as the route ways, even though it was talking about diversity. So, you know, are we building our teams up to have kind of English studies at the tip of their tongue? And by the way, that panel was with two brilliant Students' Union presidents, Sunday at Exeter and Mia at Leicester. And there's another group to build your community. Your student leaders are really crucial in that social architecture. But I'll stick to the careers bit for a minute. Does your enterprise and innovation team regularly lead talks and events with mention of English studies at the start? If not, how do we make that happen? How can you help them to find a language of innovation that comes from this subject, that's rooted in the skills and training base of what we do, and make that work in the often amazing project events, summits, sprint events that they organise? If they aren't doing this yet, then invite them into your space, make your own events, help them to be able to describe you and in future involve you. Your international office. When your international office colleagues are making a trip or setting up a new partnership, be that with partners in global contexts on a research or education level, are they speaking about English? We know that areas like data sciences are on the march, as it were, in terms of possibility and popularity and interest, but we also know that many of us around this room have brilliant collaborations and initiatives in that space. But are our international team clued up on that? When they then meet with the strategic planning team, with the likes of Simon on this call, do they have that detail at their fingertip to be able to talk about? Are we helping them raise their confidence to speak about English, and therefore to lead with those things when they're talking with global industries or with partners, or about the Sustainable Development Goals, or about global challenges, even in this week of all week, global challenges? We need to give them the stories because they need to be speaking for us. Pro-Vice Chancellor's Research and the Research Development Office, David will say a bit more on this from a more informed perspective, but at the risk of a crass generalisation, they're not rooms that are always dominated by a humanities or a shape type set of conversations. So we have to work very consciously on that agenda. We need to be at and invite the team to workshops, away days, sandpits. You need your engineers, your Pro-Vice Chancellors of Medicine, your Pro-Vice Chancellors Research speaking about English in these contexts. And you also need them to be very visibly and orderly in and around our spaces and places too. Business development teams, they're used to a world of spin-outs and IP. They're perhaps less confident in the space of cultural compacts and culture and creative industries. You often hear of corporate and business spoken of as if it's separate from culture and creative, but it's not. And actually these things need equitable work and equitable attention because they're capacity building for the regions and the cities and the places and spaces in which we all work. And they're skill building for our students too. So we need to break down those institutional assumptions about what is commercial and what is not. And then, and after all that, only then engage with your executive team, and behind and beyond them, really importantly, your governing body, whatever they're called, your council, your court. Those with cross-cutting portfolios in your executive team, the other faculties, your direct, as well as your direct faculty pro-vice chancellor or head of college or whatever they're called. And think about how you are engaging and the terms of that and what you are helping rather than what you are expecting through any sort of strategic planning or review process. Because if you think that knowledge levels are limited of our research and our teaching and our ways of being, then what are we doing to change that? And I think about the politics of how those boards are made up. So if you think about governing bodies, you know, while they're changing for the better in terms of diversity and inclusion, they still have ultimately that governance responsibility. So they're going to need people with a background in finance, audit, risk, cybersecurity, estates and capital projects. So they're going to lend to people who have been graduates of the legal and financial world. They're not your natural arts and humanities graduates. And actually current government probably tells us that even if they were, they might not be your natural advocates. So it's all about mindful, intentional engagement and discussion. So help them. And I can talk about ways that we do that through at Newcastle and ways that we did it at Nottingham, where I was before, but you'll have your own examples of how to do that. What I would say though is recognize the skills of the people on those boards. Don't see them as enemies, draw on them. They appreciate being given points of entry. And you have to choreograph that. You have to be really intentional about those conversations and make them happen. They will not just happen in the ether. And finally, and I would say this, wouldn't I, get into leadership roles. It's not a dirty word. And if we're making it a dirty word, we're our own worst enemy. I really feel that. So encourage others to get into leadership roles, not just to defend things, not to fight cases, because if that feels like your role day in, day out, it's going to be crushing. But it is to bring helpful specialist learning into the room, to bring your training to the table, to bring your expertise, and to help pull complex projects together across the university and out with the university in ways that will really feed the future of our subject area. Because it is a privilege, for all the challenges, for all the headwinds, for all the difficult days, and there are many, there are so many wonderful secondary pleasures of seeing others succeed, seeing a research team take flight, seeing the students make a better future before your eyes. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand the baton on to David in the hope we can pick some things up later. Thank you for listening.
Jenny, I think it's Simon next, isn't it?
It is, yes. I thought you might have changed the order. It's Simon, yes, if you don't mind.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen if I can, because I've got a few slides to speak to, and thank you for giving the opportunity to come and speak with everybody. Can everybody see those? Yeah, I can see less of you now, because all I can see is my screen, but I'm not going to worry about that, the joys of presenting on Zoom. So I guess what I was going to do this afternoon was just to I suppose, give a little bit of a strategic planner's perspective and touch on a little bit around data in HE, how leaders use that data, how we use that data, I think, to pick up on Julie's point, the social team, the senior team interaction, and just to think about how it helps inform strategy and hopefully give you a few insights. We can't possibly do a kind of data in HE full teaching. I think even on ESPA, which is a Strategic Planners Association, that's a 2-day course, and even then it doesn't scratch the surface, but I can at least give you some insights. And I thought, being as we're speaking to an English group who words have a lot of meaning, I thought I'd just start by deconstructing strategic planning with a little bit of a message, actually.
Simon, I'm just sorry to interrupt, but there's a crackle on your line. I don't know if
Is
other
there?
people, yeah, can other people hear that crackle? So
just let me. Is that any better?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's this headset. I'll just speak without the headset if that's okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, apologies for that. And thank you for letting me know. Just shout up again if I'm not all coming through, because it's very quiet when you're speaking. So I thought I'd just deconstruct strategic planning, just to, I suppose, to give a message that most universities do planning, but not all planning is strategic. In fact, in some cases, planning can be anything but strategic. It can fill the void for strategic thinking. It can create an illusion that what we're doing is right, and it can fill the space and time of everybody's thinking. And I think to your institution, an awful lot of the space that we should be thinking about strategy is often taken by planning. But the converse is also not true. To be strategic, you don't have to be some kind of complex cerebral planner. Being strategic is often about choice and about confidence and using data to inform that. And I think actually echoes Julie's role, that sometimes we're frightened of being strategic because in HE there's so much complex data that people will challenge every bit. But actually, we don't want leaders to drown in data. We want leaders to be confident about what they're trying to achieve and let the data have that. So that's my kind of trying to talk myself out of a job from the start, really. Let's just, I suppose, give you a bit of a sight of what strategic planners do and what my job is about. So there's different elements to it. I guess the centre of it is about being a strategist. It's about helping the university formulate a strategic plan. I'm fortunate because that was already done when I started, so that's another 5 years before we need to pick that one up at least. It's about keeping the processes going, and there's a lot of processes in universities for planning. A lot of that requires a lot of plumbing, a lot of architecture to keep all of that together. But then I think the kind of really interesting value-adding parts of the role are making all of that speak out to the institution. It's about working with people to be a coach, consultant, and a translator. Strategic planning shouldn't be a centralist activity. It's about connecting with leaders to help them make things happen, to be that focal point and energizer, and to be the change agent. And I think Julie's very keen that my role has strategic planning and change. And again, those things don't always go together. So most of you will have planning departments within your universities. I'll just give you a bit of a sense of what I think you'll find in most of them. They're all slightly different, but they'll all have an element of planning. They'll all have an element of insight. Some will have an element of change. Their role is really, I suppose, to be objective and evidence-based. It's to try and take a longer term perspective. It's to try to help leaders take the outside in, and it's trying to be integrated. And I think, as Julie said, forming relationship with those teams is really, really important to get the right answer, because we're there to serve the institution. And I think largely that's about serving the academic side more than the professional services, because I think that's where we can make a real difference. So just a little bit of perspective of when people talk about strategy, and I think often people talk about strategy, they mean different things. And this is one of my favorite little devices. I've discovered through the years that when you talk about strategy, particularly in a university, it means different things to different people depending on their own learning styles. So there's a big school of thought that says strategy is all about science, data and planning, kind of out the Porter stuff. It's about Harvard-style heavy analysis, and nothing is true unless it's got graphs and data and 2x2 matrices. There's another school of thought that says actually strategy is all about being clear about where you want to go. It's all about vision. It's all about energy. It's all about your values. It's about what you're trying to create. And then there's some people who say, forget all of that for a game of soldiers. What's the point of creating a strategy when often this is about trying an iteration? And my perspective is good strategy brings all of those together, but there's a tendency with the amount of data that's coming into the world to draw it into that bottom left-hand corner and think that that's the only space that it's true. And I think we all know that whilst that can help us, it's not going to give us all the answers, and we've got to be really careful about being drawn into that corner. The other interesting observation I have is that when I've met people who are firmly in one of those corners, the ones who are in the science and planning perspective of the world think that everybody else is not doing it properly. So there's something about convincing those people that you're using data. So that's where I come from. So just a little bit, we did some work at SUMS on why change doesn't work in universities. And one of the things we found was that strategy in many universities is quite problematic, actually. And we got some great quotes. And one, I wasn't going to go through all of this, but I spoke to a vice chancellor at one university, and he said to me, Simon, the trouble is we built a department of chemists, and what we need in this world is some alchemists. We're busy creating all these number-based solutions for a future world that's changing all the while. And what we want is an element of judgment, confidence, and going with the flow. And also what he talked about is the strategy wasn't differentiated, the league table was the same as everybody else, spending too much time on that. And then even when we get the perfect strategy, it kind of doesn't matter anyway, because everybody's so good at ignoring it because they're so good at game playing. So in a lot of universities, there's this sense that we're trying to create the perfect plan for an imperfect world. And I think there's an element of, I wanted to help give some confidence around that. And I think both the problem and the solution is data. And that's, I guess, what I wanted to come back to. So let's talk about data in HE. There's a lot of it. And if you go to the HESPA conference, there's a lot of it. And there's a lot of people who are very, very, very expert in this data. And it's very technical and it's very ubiquitous. And it's very starting to become more sophisticated, but also a lot of it is very retrospective. And I think as a head of department, there is something about working with your planning team to be able to understand and use that data. But I guess my message is embrace it, don't drown in it, don't get pulled into that bottom left-hand corner. Use all of this. There is a language about data, but data is only part of the solution. So there's a map there of all the data in HE. And yeah, you look at UCAS and the amount of stuff that's coming out of UCAS in terms of the volume of data there. And of course it can help, and of course it's really important, and of course we're there to work with that. The issue, I don't think, is just about data, it's also what we do with that data. And we'll all absolutely love the subject of league tables and what they do in terms of providing an unbiased analysis of comparative performance across you. So I don't know whether anybody knows, but anybody can start a league table. If you want to go this afternoon and create your own brand of the English Association league table of universities, there's nothing stopping you. and then you can come knocking on my door and try and charge me £50,000 to access your data and to try and, but actually league tables, they're brands, they're selling a product, but they're very powerful in the marketplace, so we need to play the game. Unfortunately, they do tend to work against institutions sometimes wanting to do their own things because we're being judged against one set of values. So it's important that we understand league tables. It is about pecking orders. They do drive institutional choices, and I think it's really, really important to understand that, because they'll drive an institution's way of its looking at its own subject areas, because institutions are deeply interested in where they fit in league tables. But they are quite complex. And if you want to find out more, I think Sally Turnbull's guide to UK higher education league tables is probably one of the best that I've seen, that helps you understand that and helps you navigate some of that. But I wasn't going to go into loads of detail on that. So a couple more slides to finish. So all of this is about data. What I think is often missing in some of this is about understanding value and distinctiveness. So in that triangle, one of the things I think is really important is when we're looking internally into a university, there's loads of data that will tell us costs, there's loads of data that will tell us performance and outcomes. But often when we're speaking to individual disciplines, the thing that really, really is important in this is understanding the value of that discipline. And how that value is perceived internally, externally by its constituents. And if it's not perceived to be offering value and differentiated and distinctive, it doesn't matter what data you throw about it, you've got a problem, and data will just highlight that. But actually, the heart of all of this is about how we create and embrace and understand value and distinctiveness. There's quite an interesting piece of work done a few years ago around distinctiveness in higher education. We used it in sums quite a lot, about asking questions: what is real, what is rare, what is relevant, to really understand how things stand out in a marketplace. And often that's about combining more than one thing than another. So that's what I'm quite interested in. So what strategic planners often like to do, and you may have this in your own institution, is to put things into analysis and 2x2 grids. And I guess some of you may or may not have seen examples of this sort of thing within your own institution. Where one of the things we're often looking at then is, what is the cost, what is the outcome, what is the value? And they tend to be then populated by metrics. So you tend to get an answer that's everything. It gives you part of the equation, but it doesn't talk about value very often. It talks about numbers, it talks about costs. And I think, and also one of the things that you might look at quite interesting in these is they tend to have their own logic and they draw you into, but they tend to then draw you into looking at individual value, which lends itself very nicely to being put on a portfolio analysis, but it doesn't look at the issue around porosity and integrated value and how things work together and interdisciplinarity. So again, I think these are the sort of things you need to embrace, but be able to work with and understand how your subject fits within that and how you can articulate value. Another example, I've just picked these out from presentations I've seen in public conferences. Another example, program review tools. Let's pull all the data together. Let's put it in a spreadsheet. Let's put some red, amber, greens on things. Let's show that to our council. Council get excited about all the reds, looking at short-term data. So unless you can wrap around that, the real value of a subject and what it's doing, you're falling into a certain set of situations that puts you on a 2x2, and you might be stuck in the bottom left-hand corner. So I think there's a real argument around how you articulate distinctiveness and value alongside and with the metrics. And like I say, if there's a problem with an area, the metrics just point that out anyway. So I come back to, for me, strategy and the way it's going with so much data. It is about evidence-based strategy, and there's loads of people out there who are pushing you can get your strategy by more sophisticated data to inform decision making. But I think we need to bring that alongside value-based strategy, which is really understanding what an institution values and what it wants to achieve, and some work more around environment and competitive work, which is where we're really deeply interested. In all the work I've done, and I've reviewed quite a few departments over the years, the answer's never in the numbers. The forward-looking stuff is always about the choices around what you want to achieve and how the numbers stack up or don't. All the numbers will often tell you is whether there's an issue now or in the past, what we're often looking for is a conversation with the leaders who can make sense of that and who can make something out of it. So the leadership piece comes out and wrapped around it. So hopefully that helps. Don't be scared by it. You can't run away from the numbers, but actually they're just part of the decision-making process that needs to be integrated, I think. That was what I was going to say, if that's okay, and then hand over to David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think Becky is probably just setting up my my presentation, sharing the screen. That's great. Thank you very much, Becky. So great pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm actually really delighted to give up my afternoon for a cause like this, which is of real importance, I think, for the discipline and for humanities. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Becky. Thank you. I should also say that it's a great pleasure to be here speaking alongside Julie, who is a former colleague. We both used to work at Keele together. And Simon did some fantastic work for us at Keele, and I think taught us a lot about strategic planning, which I hope now we are putting into proper action. So so that was, you know, that was very valuable to us. What I'm going to present here this afternoon is around QR, quality related research income. And I suppose what it becomes is a kind of case study which tries to draw out some of the really valuable points that both Julie and Simon have been reflecting on this afternoon. I've been PVC research at Keele for between 2015 and the submission date of the ref. Actually, submission date of the ref is my last day. I push the button and then head off into the sunset. But I am also a professor of Victorian literature, and I kind of go back to being that after a period of ref panel work. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Becky. I want to talk a bit about QR and what it represents as I say, a kind of case study of some of these issues around values and choices that both Julie and Simon have been outlining to us. QR, as you'll know, is a key pillar of the dual support system. UKRI we tend to go to get our competitively sought research funding from programs. Research England, on the other hand, provide that basis in regular research support income that comes to our universities. Just to give you an overview of what this comprises currently, I've given you the figures from Research England for both 2018-19 and 2019-20, and you'll see that for 2018-19 it was 1.6 billion. In the year following, it had actually increased to 1.7 to 1.7, almost 1.75 billion. So this is a significant investment by our research funders into the university system. Just to reflect a little bit on my own institution, on Keele, we are quite small, around about 11,000 students, mid-ranking but research intensive university. And for us, that means currently a kind of a yearly income in QR of about 7 million per annum. Now, what that doesn't account for is the additional funding that comes with QR for research students, RDP, strategic priorities funding, GCRF, more about that later, and knowledge exchange. So it's quite a complex, varied landscape made up of formulae which determine how you can accumulate your QR, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And it is a transparent part of the process of the higher education process. And I would recommend you have a look at the way in which Research England set out their way of handling QR on the Research England funding pages. What I really want to focus on, though, is what I've called a character sketch of QR, which is a rather hackneyed term from a literary criticism that perhaps is long dead. But I do think, going back to Simon's point about values, there is something of value in what QR provides for us. And if you look at the keywords on the Research England landscape landing page, when you look at how QR is described, then quality is sustained by a source of funding that represents stability, independence, choice. And all of this is to be garnered and supported over a long period. So those are really crucial words. And when we're talking about values and the kind of choices that we make, we really need to kind of reflect back to those. And just a final point perhaps about, a character sketch. I had to think about, what literary character is this like? Well, it's Caleb Garth from Middlemarch. So my pitch for the afternoon is that QR is Caleb Garth, representing that independence, stability, prolonged support, period of support. So we are never lost as literary scholars. We can always find our way around this landscape with the value set that we have. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Becky. At £7 million a year to protect for Keele, there is a lot at stake in the forthcoming our research excellence framework. And of course, we want it. We all, as our institutions, want to earn more QR. We want to be in a better position in a better position this time to the one that we were in last. And of course, the point about REF is that it sets a between 5 to 7 year period. You are going to live with your REF result for a considerable amount of time. It sets the tune for league tables and so on, which Simon was just talking about. So it becomes a pretty immovable part of your university's legacy over a longish period. And so, the issue of earning QR is a really important one, and it's why I think strategic planning has to be directed at REF, because if anybody asks me the question, why do we spend so much time planning REF? Well, the answer is, we need to be able to defend and be fairly confident that what we will return next time around is at least as good and certainly no worse than what we're already achieving. That does create tensions. There's no doubt about that. Of course, in thinking about the framework that we need to support REF planning in my own institution, we've designed something which does involve a lot of reading of work. It does involve a lot of oversight of the writing of environment statements and impact case studies. And there have been some colleagues who've reflected back to me the fact that in their view, I am killing collegiality. I am destroying it. And I think, you have to be prepared to hear that. That is a perspective that will come back to you. And the view will be, if you weren't spending all this time setting us tasks to do around planning REF, we could be getting on with research. And I hear that, and I recognise that as a case. I do reply, though, that REF actually gives humanities subjects a way of participating in higher education, and that is something that I think we need to remember. So I think one of the questions of choice that comes up in the points that Simon was making about values and planning is that when you're planning to sustain your QR contribution, you have to be thinking constantly about the kind of playoffs that are involved. QR is something that is to be earned by the size of your UOAs, by their volume and so on, but you are also having to think about where that will land you in the league table because of the GPA that you accumulate as an institution. So there are always questions of playoff to be addressed. The second point I'd make, and it goes back to Julie's point about understand your communities. And this, to me, has been absolutely vital, because there is a sense in which each research community has its own imagined sense of what the value of QR is to it. And they will be different. They will be different. So that if you take, for example, people from humanities and social sciences who are used to and depend on perhaps regular periods of research leave and support for their research of that nature, then the idea of QR dropping to the bottom line, supporting salaries and so on, that's a value because it enables you to close ranks at crucial periods of the year. It's very different though in the biomedical sciences and among clinical researchers who are used to much larger volumes of research funding and who could see a contribution from 7 million a year being effectively like a massive research grant, which they can use as directly allocated or so the kind of terms of research funding that we normally operate from UKRI. So there are real differences in the way that colleagues imagine QR across the institution, and part of your job is, I think, around communication of how strategically you can seek contributions from people, but you can also give something back into their research efforts. And so, you know, a key part of this, I think, going back to the points that Simon was making, is that strategy is about choices and being able to articulate those choices and why you are making them, and why they make sense, even though they may not appeal to everybody. So, you know, in a sense, I think I'm reflecting on that question of what strategic investment choices are available to senior leaders. One of the things I've become very aware of in you know, being around the sector and talking to other people in other universities is that the length of time for which institutions have been able to draw on QR will in many ways determine, in large part, how they exercise their strategic choices. It's been very instructive to talk to colleagues from post-92 institutions who've perhaps come into the research assessment framework rather later on, have actually made significant financial strides before doing so, so that, you know, their work becomes, their earning of QR becomes quite a flexible and agile sort of strategic decision about spend for them. So those kind of strategic investment choices may often be to do with where your institution sits, how long it's drawn on QR, and so on. And they are really important considerations to behold if you take over a strategic leadership role in this area. If we could go to the next and final slide, please, Becky. And I think that really reflects on the last couple of points that I want to make about QR, which I've broadly described as QR risks. You know, what are the risks around QR as we go into this period? In my time as PVC, I've been to a couple of exercises run by Research England, where Research England have asked us, in a sense, to kind of model what the future might look like. It goes back again to that question of the dual support system. What happens if the government decides to tip the balance of the dual support system more in terms of, you know, the UKRI spend, earning, you know, seeking your competitive advantage on the basis of research funding? What happens if you switch it back towards that more steady state QR support over a prolonged period? I think those are the questions that we those of us who want to go, you know, who want to do strategic leadership are going to work with in the coming period, because I think there is probably no doubt, and it's announced in the government roadmap, that the government will try to use QR in perhaps a more strategic and possibly conditional way. To give you an example of a conditional form of QR, I'd like to just maybe spend a couple of minutes reflecting on QR GCRF, Global Challenges Research Fund, which was introduced into universities about 3 years ago, it's had, going back to that question of architecture that Julie raised, it's had quite a profound effect on architecture, particularly among institutions, and I think all institutions that really value international participation and also value that kind of ethical dimension of international participation. Of course, the shock that we have at the moment is that that QR funding has been from next year just withdrawn, and it's actually been withdrawn from that global amount that I reflected on at the very beginning of my presentation. So I do feel that in this particular instance, you know, what we're confronting is a real assault on the principle of stability, and there is real erosion of trust that will set in if that decision is implemented, because, you know, there are international partners that we work with who will be massively and seriously further disadvantaged by that move. So, you know, I end with on a rather sobering note, which is to say that you know, in my view, Caleb Garth has not been well treated by this particular move. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions, obviously, with the rest of the panel.
So thank you very much. Do you want to, Becky, will stop sharing. Thank you. So on behalf of everybody, I'll applaud and thank a wonderful panel. So many ideas, so many things to think about as well, and but either things to worry about, but also a sense of opportunity as well. So I really appreciate the suggestions and the sense of the way in which our speakers have shown us a way through what can sometimes feel like overwhelming negativity externally, certainly. A couple of things I just want to mention. I'm sure that people will put their questions in the chat or raise their hands, and maybe, Becky, you can keep an eye on any hands that. But there was a wonderful, just while people are getting ready with their questions, there's I really like, I'm thinking about, my questions would be, I might get to ask them, but I'd really like to know more about influencing governing bodies from Julie, you know, how she's done it. I think that there might be more conversation to be had about the dual support, David, and a real sense of worry actually that people might have about research funding in the future. And but also thinking about Simon's talk, I'm very, very struck by the emphasis you placed on value and values. And it's really about, for me, the tying together of those two and the way in which we might make a case for our discipline and explain ourselves. So I was very struck by that. And I do wonder whether a future event, we might have an event itself on value. And I know that Janet Beer is leading a project on rethinking value so that we can make a stronger, more truthful case actually for English and other humanities disciplines and what they do in the world. But I'll pause there. So please, colleagues, it would be wonderful to, if you've got any questions, this is your moment. Oh, Anthony, I can see you waving, sorry. You go.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, just thank you for those fantastic talks, really enjoyed them. I just had a question for David about QR as a head of a research centre. I'm constantly grappling. The analogy I'd use is it's like a kind of a video game where you get these kind of gold coins, which QR money, which already exists, and I'm there as a head of research centre who kind of grasp them. But I'm not quite sure where they came from or who's made the kind of big decisions at the top. I just wondered if you had any kind of tips on trying to stop the different ways in which QR is used, then potentially begins to determine the way that research structures are set up within universities. Because the thing I'm grappling with at the moment is that we're being gradually told that, you know, if you're not using your QR for kind of, was it liquid assets you kind of use, kind of, you know, as a kind of a equivalent to a research grant. If you're not kind of using external research money to cover your basic research costs to do your research, well, then there's something suspicious about the research that you're doing. You mustn't be doing research in the right way. And that's a kind of increasing argument that I get against, obviously, that's the humanities. And I'm thinking of ways, obviously, to counteract that.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So I think what you're probably drawing attention to is the increasing importance, or it's been important for some considerable time, that full economic costing has on the assessment of research costs. One of the many ways in which QR can be used, of course, is to kind of close that gap between the 80% of funding that funding councils provide and the additional contribution that institutions need to provide. And of course, there's that great reckoning at the end of each year when you go through the track exercise to find out how your costs can be accounted for and how they've been allocated. And how much of it you've recovered. I think it's a really complex area, and I think it comes back to Simon's point about being able to show people, the full value of our work by, for example, being able to use the impact agenda and the engagement agenda as well. And I think this is where the coming period is going to be really important for thinking about the way in which we can show that knowledge exchange and so on works for our discipline as well, because I think it does. I mean, I think we are, superb at engaging with communities and showing the kind of wider benefits of a literary and humanities education. So I think when the question comes up about the fact that some areas in the university look costly and that they're not earning their research keep because they're not covering their costs sufficiently with research grant funding, for example. I think we have to be able to point to the fact that we participate fully in the knowledge exchange agenda. So being able to win some knowledge transfer awards, I think, will be important to that end, and also showing how the work is ending in impact case studies, because I think, again, we have to, it goes back to that point that Simon was making about the importance of a kind of a rounded assessment of what we do. We have to be able to show how we're contributing to, the entire research, to the entire research ecosystem. And actually, that is what QR is there to support. And I think the reality is that there will never be enough of it to account for all the time that we need to do excellent research. So when when perhaps we are challenged about gaps, we need to go back to how we are contributing in a whole variety of ways. It is a real challenge because, as I say, I find myself in an area of responsibility where where I do have to, I am responsible for the bottom line, and I have to be able to kind of give an account of that to the university. But I'm always very keen to stress the importance of the kind of values argument that sits beneath that. I don't know whether that's helpful, but I mean, I recognise exactly what you're saying about the challenges of QR, and I think one of the other issues there is that it is used for a huge variety of purposes, and not every university uses it for precisely all those purposes, but it does actually provide you with a lot of choices.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there, just pausing to see if there's any other questions going in the chat. Just while I'm waiting, I would like to know more actually from Julie about the influencing of governing bodies at Nottingham and Newcastle. And in the back of my mind with this question is really thinking about, it connects also to the idea of value and values, but I'm thinking about the toolkit that the subject associations are trying to build and the way in which people might want to, the kind of arguments that work when you're talking to people who have very entirely different background, where you're trying to explain not the importance, but the work that you do, the value of it. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I'll give a couple of examples, and people will have others. But when I first arrived at Newcastle, there were only very particular points in the year when our governing body, I came originally as a faculty pro-vice-chancellor for humanities and social sciences, a role I did for a couple of years before I moved into the deputy VC role. And this is pre-Simon's time, so I'm not blaming him. There was this thing called a strategic progress report, and the three faculty pro-vice-chancellors were kind of brought into the room, into what felt like quite a sort of difficult to interpret room. You hadn't met people, you didn't know their kind of space. And you did a 5-minute presentation, and they had a kind of data sheet. They had a list of KPIs and red, amber, greens, as Simon said. And the first time that I did mine, there was a resounding silence. And the chair of council said, right, let's get on to the interesting stuff, which was the PVC medicine, who's now our vice-chancellor. And so he and I actually went and sat down, and I went, what's going on there? Because they don't know the questions to ask. So we have to change the conversation here. So the next time I went in with, I had a bagpipe piece, I had a bit of Baroque opera, I had some poetry, I had all sorts of little videos and clips, and I was going to wow them. So I started to tell them the story, because I realized that they didn't know what questions to ask. So in a sense, I had to seed them. I had to be much, much more hands-on with that. And then it's the thing about actually inviting them in, so giving them those points of entry. And that can be meeting with students. One of the great things at Nottingham that my Vice-Chancellor did was to set up lunches before the formal council meetings and just showcase a different subject area, a different discipline. And we were allowed to come, we did it cabaret style when we did the English one, and we took in postdocs and early career people and different researchers and people who could speak really brilliantly about some new modules we were teaching, and some partners, because that's really powerful. And we just sat around tables and we talked. So there is a million one tip. I suppose for that toolkit, some of that is about seeding those stories. You know, Twitter's been a really interesting thing for me, because I push stuff out on Twitter all the time. And some of our council members are picking that up, and they're picking up the stories, because the thing they often bring to meeting is what they've just read in the paper. And I'm not joking, because to be fair to them, they've got other day jobs. But when the Times says the next negative thing about, you know, woke subjects, etc., or whatever we've done wrong this week, that's what's on their mind. So you almost need to come in counteracting that in a really positive way. So storytelling, case studies is really important. And I think, you know, showing people what it does. And the GCRF argument, I mean, David put a really beautiful point there about, and we're the most exposed university in what's happened, because we have 2 of the 12 hubs. And the reason we got 2 of the hubs and why they're so special is because they sit across HAS and STEM, if you like. They're an absolute model of global north, global south, equitable working. So this is nigh on tragedy, but we're going to keep working. And it's really important to me with our council meeting next week, where I'm actually on the table to talk about climate action and our plan of work. But these are 2 hubs about climate work, and they're doing everything from the way in which water puppets in Vietnam are educating young people about how their deltas are working, right? So I'm going to tell those stories, because it's really important that they understand not just a pound sign consequence, but all of this people consequence, those implications of some of these governmental decisions, because their newspapers might not be telling them that. There will be a version of ODA that's very different. So, you know, we're storytellers, that's what we do. And I think those case studies are really important. That can, you know, we're good at public engagement for research, and we forget to do that with our own trustees sometimes. I've certainly had to learn. I have to kind of step back and remind myself that not everybody knows it or is passionate about it like me, but I can make them know it and be passionate about it.
Thank you very much, Julie. There's a great question, and I can see that Stefan Collini's got a question as well. But first, this question from Simon James Durham. Simon, do you want to ask your own question, or would you like me to read it?
Oh, I don't mind briefly. I mean, if it's too bread and butter or too depressing a question, I'm happy to move on quickly. But you've mentioned research income, David. I mean, we can make a virtue if we want to, as a discipline, that we bring in tuition income in English, and that income that we bring is profitable as well. It should bring income to spare to our universities. Do you think it's too risky for us to make too much of a virtue for this, given the decline of English in schools? And I know that's been addressed in another event, but it seemed germane to this. Thank you.
No, you're right, Simon. It is incredibly important, and of course, the majority of a large proportion of income that we as a university get is on the basis of teaching fees. All I'd say is that it's a complicated picture at the moment because of course those costs across the teaching area are being constantly monitored as well. And if you are having a bit of a recruitment crisis as the discipline is currently, may not always serve your purpose so well. But I do think it's important. I think it's an important source of income that we raise. But I think the whole area of cross subsidy into research is again quite a complicated one. And so I think we've got to be, and it's one of the reasons why track at the end of each year is monitored quite closely by institutions about what they're saying about the recovery of their publicly funded teaching costs and so on. So all I'd say is that, yeah, of course, it's vital to what we do, and in some ways we become a bit of a victim of the way in which the research and education worlds are divided in the way our institutions account for themselves and tell stories about themselves, because I think we can't make that such a direct connection as we used to between teaching and research. But what I would say I think we can do to really reinforce the importance of that is to really develop our the stories that we tell about our research-led teaching. The excellent teaching that you get in a British university is excellent precisely because you are taught by research active academics who are feeding their their research back into their teaching. I think if we can show that, and we can also demonstrate a value of it, perhaps in not again because I was very struck by Julie's keenness not to use that kind of notion of employability, but how it can really create the kind of skills in our students that can take them into the world of employment and to fully exercise their kind of creativity. So I think there are complicated ways in which we've got to feed that positive virtue back into the system. And I think again it goes back to Julie's point about how we learn to talk to our senior manager colleagues and our governing bodies.
Thank you very much. I can see two hands up. I know that Stefan Cleany has a hand up and Julie's got a hand up. Julie, do you want to respond?
It was just a really quick follow up on Simon's question. I think you're absolutely right, Simon. I think it's not you can't do it as a simple binary, but I do think we have to have that ongoing conversation, I suppose, of what I've always voiced of the kind of there's literal and financial and there's emotional cross subsidy that happens in universities that again I think is really important to keep drawing attention to. And I used to, with my heads of school when I was faculty provost, to just occasionally reel back from a very instrumental version of tuition fees and student numbers because I said there will come a time when it has to flow the other way. So we don't want to, ring fence what we do because people say, this is our money. No, it's the institutional money. And at all kinds of times there will be different flows and we have to have that to survive. It was true when physics and chemistry were in decline and people made wrong decisions here. We need to hold our breath. We need to ride through things and trust. And so I think actually becoming literate as an organisation across all your faculties about that changing space of cross subsidy, I think is really important. I mean, and Simon will tell you a little detail that when we welcome new staff, Simon comes in and does a little quiz, and one of the questions he says is, which of the three faculties at Newcastle has the most students, and everybody gets it wrong, which is telling me we still haven't quite got the story right. Again, your governing body will see student staff ratios, but they'll see a single institutional figure. And your finance directors will be very reluctant to break that down. And there are risks in breaking it down because you start to pit faculty against faculty and create an internal market. But you do need to get those issues of scale and what happens over time really visible to people, because they have a fundamental effect on what people can do and on the student experience too.
Okay, so I can see, Stefan's had his hand up for a long time. And I think, Simon, you've got a hand up as well, but would you mind if I went to Stefan, who's been, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have a question in line with the theme of this afternoon about building alliances and mounting arguments with other groups within the university. One of the things I've noticed, and maybe you all have over the years, is that if you're talking off the record with no matter who, from vice-chancellors, pro-vice-chancellors, other colleagues, journalists, people in politics, what they will say face to face is that they all recognize that league tables are deeply flawed. Now, I'm not proposing this afternoon to raise an argument about league tables, but is there a way, in your experiences, those of you who've occupied these roles, is there a way of mustering some of this skepticism, which is extremely well grounded and there's a lot of literature behind it? Is there a way of mustering that skepticism to prevent league tables being used internally to shut down discussion on certain issues? I mean, we all know, I think, that league tables are used very opportunistically. I mean, whole institutions will use them when they think it shows their credit. But more importantly, about my question is, within an institution, a particular person in a position of power or a particular group with interest to defend will use them against a case which we may feel is actually a much stronger case in terms of arguments. But for the moment, given the kind of implacable single-figuredness of these league tables, is going to lack for the same kind of argumentative purchase. So I'd be very interested to hear if any of you on the panel have thoughts about how we can, as it were, marshal the well-founded discontents with this in a way of making that effective in internal argument.
Shall I kick off? I'll kick off, and it's a really great question, Stefan. I think what I'd say is that I would try. I haven't. What I would draw on is, I think, a very positive move that has been introduced recently because of the concern about the misuse of research metrics in assessing career opportunities of all kinds. So, you know, we know it as DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. And what, you know, and institutions who are going into the REF, again, this is another one of the benefits of the REF, I think, and the determination of Research England to create, as far as possible, a kind of a transparent and fair system. You know, we really have to sign up to DORA to say that, you know, we will treat our researchers ethically and according to the principles set out in DORA. Now, if we're doing that for our researchers, it seems to me that it's behaviour that we need to observe as an institution as well. I should say, in practice, I've never actually been in a decision-making process where league table positions was that deterministic. I think that league table positions, they, as Simon indicates, they form a view, they shape actions and so on, but they've never, in my experience at any rate, been that deterministic on decision making. So I'm kind of encouraged by that as you know, just something that I've noticed in practice, and I'm pleased to have noticed in practice. But I would say that if that nightmare scenario emerged, where you did have somebody who was determined to shut something down exclusively because of league tables, I think you would just have to point to, you know, the kind of practices observed nationally indeed internationally by a phenomenon like DORA.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I did some work with the university a few years ago, which was about what they were trying to be, creating their own set of measures. A league table result came in that was not in their favour, and the council beat the Vice Chancellor up for why are we not high in this. Despite having had the conversation about what they agreed was important, they were still massively swayed. So we do know that league tables are influential, and I think no institution can exist and completely ignore them. I guess what I've observed over the years is the institutions that are more confident about their own reputation and distinctiveness and probably rely less on the league tables as the only proxy in the recruitment market, because I think that's the reason people are so concerned about league tables, are probably less blown about in the wind by league tables than institutions that are less confident. So to me, it goes back to that really important bit about as a strategic planner, what you want is a portfolio of departments within your university that are clear about their own role and value and contribution. You want some within that mix that really add to the distinctiveness of the institution. You want some that really add, and I think institutions that are successful, nearly all of them have a broad portfolio where some departments play different roles to others. And they understand that and they respect that and they allow internal cross subsidies to exist so that overall the institution does better. And I think that all plays to. So I think the whole bit about understanding role, value and contribution internally is really, really important. And not just for now, it's not a static conversation. It's about where we're going into the future. It's about how can we actually get to a position where we're protecting that and investing in some areas, because actually that's what this is about. And I guess we know, don't we, from the work on distinctiveness, that most people only know a few things about an institution. So we don't need everything to be there. We just need, and you know, I'm taken with some of the institutions I work with that have a fantastic reputation, but it's often built on 5 or 6 really strong departments and the others playing. So it's a team game for me, and it's a team game. But the other bit about league tables is underneath the league tables, I think the ability to benchmark some elements of data and actually compare elements of performance. Whilst I would agree with you that there are some elements of league tables that are deeply flawed, some of the underlying elements of that are actually really useful in terms of us taking an honest view about performance, but we just need to be careful to make that a mature debate. So it's a really complex space, but I do think the thing about institutional confidence, about understanding which bits actually add to distinctiveness, what's the role, value and contribution, are really important. And I guess within that, that's part of the discussion this afternoon, isn't it? Because if you're a science department, everybody thinks you're going to bring in the next 5 million IP sell-off and the big research thing. That's kind of, people are less nervous about that than a department where they're thinking, well, there isn't the big research income here and there isn't this. So it's how English works to play into that, I think, and I think it can be done. So I don't know whether that answers or not, but
I think that's really interesting, Simon. I mean, I suppose that the reality for most of us is that we're in universities, or people in universities where, you know, it seems to me you have a very enlightened view of university strategy. But actually, when you're on the ground, that there's that element of competition, and it's about having the between subjects, even within the humanities, between universities in close proximity or further afield. And it's about, you know, I don't really know what my question is, but I suppose the problem I'm wrestling with is how one creates a more positive conversation whereby that's some of that, you know, you can talk about strengths across, but that not everybody's got to be the same.
no.
It's a challenge, actually.
So I'll just give you one small example, then pass over. One of my roles in my previous institution used to run a budget model that we ran 40, 50 odd departments. At the end of the year, we'd looked at which ones weren't meeting the financial performance, and we basically put them on the naughty step and say we wanted to do a review, and we'd end up with 6, 7 or 8 departments every year where we were trying to go into. It wasn't a very positive model, but it's just an example that sets the context. In nearly all of those departments, we ended up having a conversation around the finances not adding up It was much more of an easy conversation where the head of department had already done quite a lot of work with the FD to talk about what the future and what they were trying to achieve. The ones where we'd got a real problem with is where the department approached it in denial. We didn't know what they did. We couldn't actually saw anything distinctive, and all they wanted to do was argue with us about the figures being wrong. In most of those cases, those departments didn't come out well. So that bit Julie said about actually understanding, having a dialogue around where we're trying to get, and where everybody knows there's fluctuations in the market, and some disciplines tend to go down and up, and it's being able to have that conversation in a mature way is so important. So I think a discipline, knowing its place and knowing what it's trying to achieve is a really important part of the conversation around the value that plays into all of this.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad this is being recorded. I say this as a long time ago head of school who was always being put on the naughty step, so I know what it feels like. But in the chat, there's some really interesting comments. Alex, I don't know whether you want to step in.
I've been enjoying and really value everything that all three speakers have put in. I think the thing that had struck me most when Simon's speaking, and it's something that I'm very familiar with from the conversations we've had about supporting departments, is that modeling that willingness to be forward thinking is critical. And I think that the two things we've come up against over and over again in our conversations internally are being informed. And I think that speaks to your point about denial, that you need to know those figures and you need to be open about it, but also to speak positively, confidently, but in a future-oriented way. And that's, I think, a real cultural risk within our discipline and potentially within the humanities, because we are all about tradition. It kind of defines the heart of what we do, but tradition is a handing over to the future. Okay, too much Gadamer. The other point I was just going to pick up on, which I think is really helpful, is thinking about the idea of distinctiveness. One of the difficulties we sometimes have in defining what we do is that English studies is a very broad church, and there are multiple different perspectives from hardcore linguistics through to essentially area studies, and English doesn't cover well the diversity within the British Isles or the international situation. But that undoubtedly means there's an enormous amount of opportunity for distinctiveness at departmental, school or program level, and that we should be able to find a way to not be competing, because we can all do something different and define it in different ways. And I think I do think this is an issue arising from league tables in part, and from the incredible vacuousness of many university kind of like missions when they stress excellence. This is a kind of homogenization. And I think the key for the discipline, as for the sector, is to allow ourselves to articulate the differences and to be confident in that. But for us, we have a really broad base, and I think there's a good opportunity to start from that.
Can I just respond briefly to that? Just that if there's a really interesting piece of work, it's about 5 years old now, by the Leadership Foundation in Higher Education, did a piece on distinctiveness in higher education. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. There's some books out there. It's a really good piece of work. And it provides a simple framework of looking at what's real, rare and relevant. And there's some interesting case studies. I can dig it out and share it. But what I learned from that piece of work is people often try and find distinctiveness on too fewer dimensions. And it's really, really difficult to be distinctive just as an English department. The trick to getting it right is combining one or two features that, when you bring them together, that are real, rare and relevant in combination, that you can create a story around. And it's a really interesting piece of work. I think it's well worth looking at, actually.
We would really value having that. If you were able to share that document, that would be fantastic, Simon. Thank you. I can see that Claire's hand is up, and this might be the last point before we move to close.
Thanks, Joni, and thanks to all our panelists. It's a fantastic presentations, and very rich and very important, I think. I think we really do need to think very hard about what would happen if we started calibrating value and distinctiveness, actually. And I think that would be something that I'd be interested to figure out. But in terms of English studies, yes, I just want to echo Alex. We do have a hugely broad base. That's really actually a valuable resource. even though it means that we can't capture English studies in one sentence, which is a challenge. But I just want to make a very concrete suggestion. I think those of us who are working on the kind of toolbox and working on this project collectively could do some future thinking. I think that would be some future planning, just some future modelling. I think that would, for the discipline and for related disciplines and for distant disciplines, you know, I think that would be a very interesting project. And I think that might help us reflect back to the present at the moment, and actually help. That might be one of the ways that we can build confidence in the discipline and in ourselves, because I don't think we are as confident a discipline as we should be.
I don't think we're as confident a discipline as we used to be.
Yeah.
There have been many knocks.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's now 3:25. We haven't needed breakout groups, and I'm rather relieved by that. I wasn't sure whether that would be useful or not. The risk is that actually maybe not everybody's had, people haven't had a chance to say what they wanted to say. So a group of us will stay behind, certainly until 4 o'clock if people want to carry on the conversation. But I just want to really give a huge, well, can thanks be huge, heartfelt thanks to our 3 speakers who've been so thoughtful and provocative and full of ideas. It's been really marvelous. Well, thank you so much for giving up. I know these are very, very busy people. So thank you. I think you can see from the chat and the hands up just how you know, grateful people are to have a chance to have this conversation. That leads me on to the what next, and we have got, I'm very struck by the, well, obviously we need to digest and get thoughts, feedback from you, and please feel free to email myself and Becky Fisher if you've got ideas. But I suppose that values came out as a very strong theme in this afternoon session. And I'm also very keen to make use of the generous offer of the British Academy to work with us on thinking about policy. I'd like to propose that that might be the next topic for Speaking for English. But I'm really up for ideas. And we've got some very distinguished people on the call as well. And colleagues will know of the sort of influencers, the senior managers, the humanities-friendly colleagues who work at the top of their universities. If you want to make your own suggestions, we would really welcome that. And if people want to find out about the toolkit, please, we've got Catherine Heavey on the call. I'm sure she'll take emails, and Bob Eagleston as well. But I'm going to pause there. There's lots going on in the chat, so I'm definitely going to save that. Thank you. So, thank you very much. So I'm going to stay. If you want to go, feel free. So. Okay, so I've just saved the chat, and I hope you have as well, Becky, because I have a habit of then saving something else. And wow, that was really, really helpful, and the conversation was just fantastic. Actually, there's a real readiness to you know, hear from people with this kind of experience. And I can see people on this call with whom I've had many conversations before about these kind of issues. It's Jennifer Cook from Loughborough, Ben Davis, Catherine Morley. Lovely to meet you at last, Catherine. So I haven't got an agenda for this, so it's just for us to continue the conversation and to think a little bit more.
Do you want me to stop the recording, Jenny, so people can feel free to speak?
Yes.
Is that all you need from me, Jenny?
It is, Simon. Simon, thank